Hi, I'm very pleased to be part of the Australian Fighting on All Fronts book launch. I think it's an important issue that we're facing today with the 70th anniversary of World War II because it's not just history. It's something that not only shapes the world we live in, but it's very much an active part of life today. David Cameron, for example, the British Prime Minister, recently said that World War II was a battle against tyranny. Just as our armed forces have in Afghanistan, Libya, Mali, and elsewhere around the world. In other words, World War II is the myth underlying modern imperialism for the USA, for Britain. But if you think about Putin in Ukraine, it's a similar sort of thing. It's used as an excuse. The second myth that this book is directed at and explodes, I think, is the idea that somehow the processes of society that go on in normal times disappear somehow. They're suspended by war. We have the unity of the nation. The troops, they died for us. We're all in it together. All of that sort of stuff comes out. Basically, the concept that there is a national interest that lies above class. And what Fighting on All Fronts shows is that could not be further from the truth. In fact, what we see in the Second World War is a continuation of the normal life processes of capitalism, the competition between the bosses, between their states, in the terms of imperialism, and also the fight to exploit and oppress people. All of these are going on at the same time. And we also see, and the book is focused on this, the fight back. That it's not simply a one-way process, that there was a struggle against imperialism, a struggle against oppression and against exploitation. And I think the way that you can conceive of this, before looking at the book itself, to conceive of what's going on here is to see that the Second World War really went through three phases. The first phase was straight imperialism. The outbreak of the Second World War was tied 100% to imperialist competition between the Axis bloc and the Allied bloc. The Allied bloc had a long time to build up its resources and its power. Russia, France, Britain, together, just these three countries controlled more than half of the planet. The competition, the Axis powers, on the other hand, what little they'd had, Germany, for example, they'd lost in the First World War. These are new powers, rising powers, and they wanted their share. Well, they wanted what they could get, and they were going to take it from the Allies. And really, that's where the war kicks off from. Straightforward straightforward imperialist competition. But this war, unlike the First War, as we'll see, unleashed a second process, because what it did was it opened up, because of its nature, both struggles from below, struggles against oppression. It was a very, very different war to the first grand imperialist war of 1914 to 18. And I just want to really explore one area of that, and that is to do with the way the war was fought. Because the First World War was a war that, at least in Europe, was a war of trench warfare. And that meant relatively static fronts. The Second War, because the technology had changed, aeroplanes, tanks and that sort of thing, it meant that there was a very, very rapid movement. The sweep of Germany across Europe, the sweep of Japan across East Asia, these were new. And what they meant was that the old orders were disrupted. In Allied countries, in France, in Denmark, a whole number of places, you have Nazi occupation. In East Asia, you have the Japanese sweeping away the former colonial powers. And what this meant was there was an opening for resistance from below. People had to act without their established governments. In Europe, the governments are in exile. And also, in terms of Asia, the colonial powers are demonstrated to be weak and can be overthrown. And that gives rise not only to struggle against occupation, but struggle against colonialism in general, the present occupiers and the past occupiers. At the same time, the Allied bloc needs people behind the lines. So there's a temporary alliance between the imperialists and the movements from below, as they have a common enemy. Temporary alliance. And you can see this in Russia, for example, Stalin and the people, who he'd been oppressing viciously up until that point. There's a temporary alliance. In the Philippines, the USA, the Huks, you can see it there. In China, there's an alliance, formally anyway, between the Kuomintang, the nationalists, and the Communist Party of China, led by Mao. And in Burma again, we see these sorts of alliances. So the war begins as an imperialist conflict, pure and simple. It develops into a more complex situation of movements from below, movements against colonialism in alliance with the Allied forces. And then we have the end of the war. Because at the end of the war, the temporary alliance comes to an end. The natural class struggles, the natural struggles against oppression and exploitation, these take off. And therefore we see a third phase, and that phase is really the battle to see whose war was it. Was it a war for imperialism? Was it a war for the people? Now, I don't know if you've come across My People's History of the Second World War. The strength of this book is that it doesn't, unlike that one, it doesn't hammer home a specific argument. What we have, and I think this is the richness of the book, is 9 different writers, each picking, with expertise on their own countries, picking those countries and looking at specific issues that come up. I'll leave the Australian team to talk about what they did in regards to Australia, Japan, Jews and the Philippines. But the book has a whole number of other sections. Algeria, for example, looks at Frank Rankin, the German writer, looks at the role of US imperialism from 1942, very, very early. The idea that US only became an imperialist power post or at the end of the war, with the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. No, much, much earlier than that. So we see that in Algeria, plus the rise of a radical independence movement. So the two coexist in Algeria. Very interesting, I think. In Burma, we see a resistance movement that was able to actually, very cleverly, play off different imperialist camps against each other, working with the Japanese, initially against the British, and then with the British against the Japanese, the net result being Burmese independence. In China, we have, again, a different situation, a pre-existing revolution upon which there is the Second War is superimposed. And if anybody's familiar with Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, there's a very interesting interplay of both the war and permanent revolution there. And really the question is, was permanent revolution applicable to the entire war? We can argue about that. There's a small argument about that in the book. Ireland is another one, which is a surprise in a way to have in a book on the Second World War, because it was a neutral, but it was a neutral that had been a British colony just 17 years before. So the evolution of the war in Ireland is very, very interesting. And finally, Slovakia, a resistance movement which combined both the movement from below, the movement from above, and some very complex interactions. Now, in the very brief time I've got left, I just want to run through Russia, just to bring out some of the key features of both imperialism and struggle from below. Clearly, Russia's important. It was the country that was most important in defeating Hitler. Half of the people who died in the Second World War died in Russia. Stalingrad, which was the turning battle of the Second World War, took place obviously in a battle between the Germans and the Russians. Now, you can see imperialism writ large from the beginning. 1939, Stalin and Hitler enter a pact. Stalin has built up his imperialist strength because he knew that to play part of that game he had to have a big army. So Russia was very strong. It had 4 times as many tanks, it had twice as many planes, and so on. But at the same time, because Stalin had built his power on mass exploitation, it required mass repression as well. And just before the Second World War broke out, he purged 40,000 of his troops, all 90% of district chiefs of staff, 80% of corps and divisional commanders, and so on. So Russia shows both the imperialist side plus the oppressive side. when the war begins, because he's so weakened and destroyed his army, it's a disaster. Stalin has led his army into complete disaster. 5 million troops are taken prisoner and starved to death, basically. Thousands of planes are destroyed on the ground. So the only way that Russia can come out of the war was through People's War. And when you look, and I haven't got time to go into it now, but when you look at the struggle of the people, the heroism, the level of popular uprising, involvement, the partisans, it's incredible. And so really, Russia would, if it had been for Stalin, Russia would have lost the war for everyone. It was actually the Russian people that saved it. And yet, at the end of the war, the temporary alliance that I talked about does not continue. What did Stalin do? Well, anybody who was a prisoner of war was immediately, and returned at the end of the war, was immediately interviewed by Smersh, counter-espionage organisation. Hundreds of thousands were, 900,000 were arrested, tens of thousands were sent to the Gulag, killed, and so on and so forth. In other words, the three phases of the war come out very, very clearly in Russia. But just to conclude, because my time is up, I'm hoping that this has given some sort of indication of what there is in fighting on all fronts. But I'm sure that the people down there in the Antipodes will be able to do a much better job in presenting what's in it than I've done. But I hope that the launch goes well. Thanks very much for your time.